My name is Josef Parnas. I am a psychiatrist and a professor of psychiatry at the University of Copenhagen. And the topic of the lecture today is the issues of psychiatric classification and the place of the schizophrenia spectrum in this classification. So there will be some sort of small historical part which is necessary to understand where we are today and perhaps how we can get out of the predicament we are facing today. Talking about classification and psychiatric classification necessitates some familiarity with some basic concepts. And one basic concept is the concept of typification. Typification stems from the word type, and it means that in our perception and cognition, which form a whole, it is not that we have sort of totally separate functions. In our perception and cognition of the world, we always perceive the world in terms of certain categories with which our mind is equipped through experience. In other words, we experience the unknown in terms of the known. We always try to fit the object of perception into some sort of type which is adequate for that perception. And this is called typification, and this enables us to very quickly recognize the situation as being a certain situation. Seeing something is always seeing it as something. And the example I can give you that if we look at a street from our window and we see a bus departing from a bus stop and a man is running after the bus, we'll perceive that man as running up to catch up with the bus. The process of categorization of the world, the process of classification of the world is always with us. So classification is basically a most fundamental feature of human cognition. So we divide the world into groups which are in some way meaningful to us. They may be meaningful in a very simple, pragmatic way. For example, if you go to IKEA mall in order to buy some piece of furniture, the IKEA mall is divided into sections. You have a section for the living room equipment, you have a section for kitchen equipment, you have a section for bedroom equipment, and so forth. So the IKEA people, they divide their stuff into certain categories which have some pragmatic meaning for us who are the buyers and clients in IKEA. So classification is a very ordinary feature of human cognition. And the question then is, how do we move from this ordinary classification of everyday life to a scientific classification? And basically, what is scientific classification? Here we have two other terms which are relevant for psychiatry. We have the term nosography and nosology. Nosography is almost never used any longer. Nosography means description of diseases. Nosology means division of diseases into classes. There is a difference between nosography and nosology because nosology has some sort of theoretical baggage in terms of some etiological hypothesis linked to the classes of nosology. A true scientific classification must be made on some sort of metastructure or a principle of classification system. So for example, if we look at biology, the classic classification of plants made by the Swedish biologist Linnaeus was based mainly on similarity of morphological features. So the plants which resembled each other, they were categorized in the same class, and those which were different were in other classes. Since then, we have got a genetic classification, and what is interesting is that Linnaeus' classification was basically right even in terms of the genetic classification. In biology in general, we have today classifications which are based on biological genetic profile. So, for instance, we do not classify bats with birds because these are two completely different kinds of animals. A scientific classification presupposes also that the world is divided into some sort of objective classes. These objective classes, which exist in the world independently of whether humans are present or not present, are called natural kinds. It is a basic expression in whole discussion of classification. An example of natural kinds would be that you have lions and tigers, and they are natural kinds. They are different. They look different. They live in a different way. They move in a different way, and so forth. And for instance, in biology, the assumption was that such classes of animals which could not breed together were separate natural kinds. Today we know, for example, that lions and tigers may breed together, so you can have a sort of hybrid animal, half lion, half tiger. Nonetheless, the basic principle of scientific classification is that we work with natural kinds. The best example of classification, which is beautiful in its simplicity, is the periodic system. The periodic system classifies the matter in terms of elements whose place in the table of periodic system is specified by the atomic number and the atomic composition. And the cells in the periodic system which are empty can be scientifically predicted to be in a certain way, even if they do not exist today. When we look at psychiatric nosology, then psychiatric nosology is a part of medical nosology for historical reasons. As you all know, psychiatry became medicalized in the beginning of the 19th century. And since then, psychiatry has been a part of medicine. And therefore, the psychiatric nosology is submitted to certain scientific theories and scientific ways of thinking, which perhaps are not quite adequate for psychiatry. If we have a look at the medical classification, then the medical classification is basically anchored in the division of the body into organs and systems. So you have, for example, hepatology, which is a part of medicine which is concerned with liver diseases. You have gastroenterology, which is concerned with the digestive system. You have neurology, which is concerned with the nervous system, and so forth. The single diseases in the medical classification are defined through their etiology. So if you have a tuberculosis, for example, then the definition of tuberculosis includes the notion of infection, the notion of an infectious pathogen, in this case, tuberculosis bacteria, and This would go in the same way for many somatic diseases, but not all somatic diseases. Many somatic diseases do not have one single etiology, but rather multiple etiologies. But nonetheless, whether they are multiple or single, they are sort of objective etiologies. So you have, for instance, diabetes 2, which may be caused by multiple factors, but all these factors have sort of objective existence in the world. And psychiatry has tried and is trying to replicate this approach to classification. And I will say a few words now about the adequacy of that approach, and then continue with presentation of psychiatric nosology. One problem with psychiatric nosology is that it seems, at least to me, that it is not really following the medical model, and it is not unproblematic to apply medical model to mental conditions without any transformations or any modifications. The reason I'm saying it is that we have now had medical model with psychiatry for more than 200 years, but we have not arrived yet at any sensible classification or sensible understanding of mental disorders. So this is a sort of skeptical prelude to what I'm going to say now. The psychiatric nosology was basically formed already in the middle of 20th century. So let's say by the 1940, 1950, we had a certain structure of psychiatric nosology, which was with us until DSM-3 and ICD-10. And this structure was the following. There was one big group of organic disorders, which were disorders caused by either physical or chemical impact on the brain of some noxious agent. So dementias were in this group, intoxications could be considered in this group. It could be said otherwise that that was the group in which we had an etiological diagnosis. Like, let's say, in delirium tremens, we had an etiological diagnosis as a psychosis caused by alcohol withdrawal syndrome. The second large group was the so-called endogenous or functional psychosis, which comprised schizophrenia and bipolar illness and milder variation of these psychotic conditions. And it was assumed that these disorders were either hereditary. The reason they were called functional was that no organic pathology could be detected. An average clinician considered this group of disorders as a sort of serious disorders which had some sort of aspect of structural disturbance in the mind and had also a potential to persist to some degree. Then we had the third category, which was called the so-called neurotic disorders. And these disorders, such as anxiety, phobias, OCD, stress-related affective reactions, and so forth, they were basically considered as psychologically understandable, either in terms of the circumstances of the patient or in terms of the patient's past. They were typically considered as being fleeting, and they were typically considered as involving a sort of very superficial symptomatology. It would mean that, let's say, in anxiety disorder, there would be amplification of anxiety, which is a normal phenomenon in human life. It is quite normal for all people to experience. And finally, we had a fourth group of personality disorders, which were considered as extreme variants of personality traits. So let's say a paranoid personality would be a personality in whom a sort of normal tendency to be a little bit suspicious and on guard was amplified to a level which entailed some sort of behavioral interpersonal consequences. So what happened then in the introduction of the so-called polythetic systems? Well, what happened was that this categorical system which existed previously was based on very detailed clinical descriptions of, let's say, schizophrenia or bipolar illness. These descriptions were found in rich textbooks and in classic descriptions, and it was the obligation of a clinician to be familiar with those descriptions. And his task in diagnosing a patient was to match the individual patient to a sort of prototypical picture of schizophrenia or prototypical picture of bipolar illness. And to the extent that the match was reasonable, then the patient received the diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And all this is not to say that single symptoms didn't count. Of course, they counted because they entered into the prototype, like hallucinations, delusions, mood swings, and so forth. But the idea was that the psychiatrists had to have a certain whole of the presentation. This whole of presentation involved also temporal aspects, which means the evolution of the illness, the premorbid style, what happened years up to the admission, and so forth, the social situation. All these were parts of the diagnosis. So in 1980, there was published Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in its third version, and it is usually called the so-called operational revolution. The operational revolution consisted in the following aspects. One was to abandon this grouping of disorders to which I referred before, with this big four base classification. So the hierarchy between the disorders was more or less deleted, so to say. This was one aspect of it. The second aspect, which was perhaps even more important, was that prototypical description was completely abandoned in favor of diagnosis based on a number of criteria. So let's say a disorder X was defined by 10 different symptoms or signs, so-called criteria. And if the patient had 4 of those 10 symptoms, then he merited the diagnostic allocation. And the criteria which entered into DSM-3 and later into the ICD-10 were not invented de novo. They were not something which the creators of those systems thought about. They were taken from these old prototypical descriptions. So, of course, depression was defined in terms of certain depressive symptoms. Schizophrenia was defined in terms of what was described before to be a part of schizophrenia. What happened to these definitions of the criteria is that with time, clinicians forgot or were not able to access this knowledge, forgot the sources of the description. So the criteria were defined in a sort of common sense lay language, and it was assumed that clinicians would understand those criteria in the same way across cultures, across different countries, and over time. And that is, of course, nonsense, because that's not how the language operates. It must be added here that in the creation of DSM-3, there was no conceptual group which helped creating the system. There was no epistemological group which helped to create the system. So the end result was a sort of naive conversion of prototypes into criteria-based categories with elimination of the hierarchies between the categories. So in today's systems, such as DSM-5, for example, or ICD-10 and the coming ICD-11, we are operating with nearly 400 or more descriptively defined categories. What can we say about those descriptively defined categories? Well, if you have 400 descriptively defined categories, you will find a tremendous overlap between different disorders. So we have a phenomenon of comorbidity, where a single patient is allocated 4 or 5 different psychiatric diagnoses because there is no hierarchy in the system. And that is, of course, a complete nonsense. Then you have a semantic drift of the meaning of this single criteria. If you look, for example, at the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, which now is one of the most frequent psychiatric diagnoses, the criterion of impulsivity is no longer understood by clinicians as a personality trait, because impulsivity as a personality trait should be always present in different situations as a tendency to act and react shorter than it is normatively considered as appropriate. So what clinicians today classify as impulsivity is what we previously called impulsive behavior, where, for instance, in schizophrenia, you have certain patients who have sort of burst out of some crazy action, of some crazy behavior, of what was called once autistic activity, or as called by Conrad, crazy actions, unsinnige Handlung. So the psychiatrists have lost the sense of distinction between what is impulsivity as a trait of character and what is impulsion, which is a sort of a phenomenon of mental disintegration and a breakthrough of a behavior which is either meaningless or has idiosyncratic meaning for the patient. These categories of today are based on criteria which belong to another context. And these criteria have changed their meaning. And for that reason, we have a diagnostic system which doesn't work, because a comorbidity at a level of 5 or 6 diagnoses makes the system completely meaningless. The final aspect of this development is that categories are being added because of pragmatic concerns. Pragmatic concerns may come from clinicians, especially in the United States. It is a question of insurance. If you don't have a psychiatric diagnosis, you cannot get refunded your medical expenses. So you need to have categories which cover all variants of human unhappiness or malfunction. But the problem with adding categories and adding symptoms is that the diagnostic system has systemic character, which means that you cannot change a little corner of it without this change being propagated throughout the entire system. That's how language works. If you introduce a new adjective, such as this is cool, then you have change in all other adjectives in terms of their use and meaning. So the problem with this pragmatic addition of categories is that they influence other categories which become even more obscure in usage. This is the fundamental problem of contemporary classification that has led to some sort of nihilistic views of psychiatric classification, that has led to the NIMH coming up with the Research Domain Criteria Project as a sort of biological reductionist alternative to psychiatric classification. So in a certain sense, psychiatric classification is threatened on the theoretical level, is threatened on the level of funding, but it's also threatened by itself on the level of its malfunction. And if we have a look, very brief look, on the place of the schizophrenia spectrum, then the situation becomes even more complicated, so to say, because schizophrenia spectrum is defined or is characterized by a sort of, we could say, 3 layers of symptomatology. We have the core of schizophrenia spectrum, which is connected to certain structural changes in subjectivity and subjectivity's basic relation to the world. So we could call it the core level. The next level would be a sort of neurotic or pseudo-neurotic level, which means that we can have symptoms such as anxiety, OCD, anything can be seen in the schizophrenia spectrum. And then the most sort of thematic level of the schizophrenia spectrum is the psychotic level involving delusions and hallucinations, catatonic phenomena, disorganized behavior, and so forth. All these levels interpenetrate each other. So it's a sort of simplification and abstraction to talk about those levels. But the problem with classification of schizophrenia today is that in schizophrenia you can see the symptoms of anxiety, you can see the symptoms of depression, you can see the symptoms of obsessions and compulsions, and so forth. So there is a tendency today among clinicians to misdiagnose patients who in reality suffer from a schizophrenia spectrum disorder with disorders such as borderline, depression, OCD, and so forth. And there are several empirical studies now showing that borderline patients, OCD patients, autistic spectrum patients, in fact suffer from the schizophrenia spectrum disorder if you observe some sort of psychopathological rigor. Thank you very much.